All right. Well, thank you once again to Tori and Greg and Appalachian Bear Rescue for hosting my book club. And it's on the book that I wrote called Spooning a Bear. And today we're going to be talking about chapters 9, 10, and 11. And Tori and I were just joking about chapter 9, which I'm going to dive into right away. If I could get my slides to click forward. Chapter 9 is called Loving Bears to Death, and it's uh, subtitled The Phone Call. And if you read the book, it's literally verbatim of a phone call I had with a woman in East Tennessee. I don't recall whereabouts she lived, but it was one of the strangest calls I ever had. And if you read that chapter, you'll know why. But I'll give you everyone a brief summary about that. Because what that phone call entailed, I was obviously the curator of the Bear Center at the time, and what that phone call entailed was this woman who was extremely concerned about a cub that was in her apple tree. And so I answered the call, and you could tell she was kind of panicked and a little frantic in her voice. And she immediately wanted me to come out there and rescue this cub from her apple tree. And there was some back and forth trying to get the information from her. And I'm sure as Tori and Greg can attest, it's sometimes difficult to get all the information you need in order to handle some of these calls. But I was trying my best to find out what exactly was going on with the situation. And she described what apparently sounded just like a young cub that was up in our apple tree. And at first, I really wasn't in the panicked mood that she was in because cubs love being up in trees. Moms put cubs up in trees, and either they're feeding nearby. Sometimes the mother bear will actually leave the cub up in a tree and she can go off and feed because if a mother bear can feed, she will be feeding her cub later on when that cub is nursing off of her. And so it was not that strange of an incident to pretty much have a cub up in an apple tree. And so she's explaining to this, and I tried talking her off the ledge that it's completely normal, and she was growing more and more frantic. And it turns out that there were bears trying to come in to this apple tree. And so I was kind of deducing maybe one of those bears that was coming in was probably the mother. And she was adamant that it was not. And she was saying there's two or three bears that were coming to the apple tree trying to get at the cub. And that led me to believe more so that it was probably the mother trying to come in. And she was adamant it was not because the bears were acting aggressive and she attributed that aggression to being male bears. And the thing that surprised me the most was when she said her husband was outside standing guard underneath this apple tree trying to protect the cub. And that caught me off guard. And I immediately told her, you might want to get your husband inside because it's probably not a very safe situation to be fending off these bears that are trying to get at this apple tree or at this cub. And she assured me her husband was in no dire threat at all. And that was because he knew karate. And so this is actually the second time I'm using a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle graphic, so I think I can consider
That's
my
awesome.
career complete and I could retire for now. But you can tell I was completely flabbergasted. And this is oftentimes what happens when you're dealing with the public. They will throw curveballs at you all the time. And sometimes they're meaning well, but they're not thinking things through all the way. And so one of the things that was really important in this book, and you notice in a number of the chapters that I write, the bears teach me a ton. And if you read the life lesson that I have in chapter 9, and I'll read it to you, it says, the best intentions may not always be the best. While it's often hard to accept the natural cycle of life or the ways of animals, good custodians of wildlife need to exercise patience and always lean to the side of observer rather than active participant. And that's where she failed because her and her husband were actively trying to participate in this bear's lives, whether or not it was trying to protect the bear or doing whatever. And so I actually was kind of looking forward to having a discussion with Tori and Greg about this because I will tell you, during the time that I was at the Bear Center, I think I had 43, 42 or 43 bears come through the center when I was managing it. And I can tell you without a doubt, there were a number of cubs. I couldn't tell you the exact number, but I can tell you without a doubt, there were a number of cubs that were in our care at the Bear Center that should not have been there. And it was literally the result of good Samaritans trying to do what they thought was best, and in the process may have unintentionally orphaned the cub because oftentimes people will see a lone cub thinking and fearing the worst. They'll try to quote unquote rescue that bear and then bring it in, and eventually it works its way to the bear center. And like I said, I can almost assure you that there was a number of cubs that came into the bear center that probably were not orphaned at all. Whether the mom left the cub there intentionally, something was occupying the mother bear. She could have been like trying to lead another threat away from the cub. So you never really know what's going to happen. But I did want to ask that question to Tori and Greg. What are your thoughts about getting cubs in from well-meaning folks that just don't know any better? Do you think that happens?
Uh, I think it used to happen more for sure, but these days with technology and videos and cameras and stuff, we can do a better job of confirming if the mom is possibly there or not. And we try and wait a while before going to catch a cub, and I don't. I can't say this doesn't happen because it does. We try very hard to stop people from grabbing cubs. It's really hard to stop people from grabbing cubs. Sometimes they call you and they've already got it in their hands. But and you probably that's probably what you had happen, I bet. But
Yeah.
um, there have been a couple times where same thing, cubs in a tree, and folks are like, well, they've been there for a while, and it's like, well, how long? A couple hours, and even when they say it's been there the day before, it's still sometimes like, well, did you see it there all day the day before, or is it there yesterday and it's there again today? And there's been somewhere it's been 2 days, and then they call and they're like, hey, the mom is here, the mom's here, like it's back, it's finally like came back to get them. And so we try and wait at least 48 hours before even starting to try and catch a cub. And I think with the videos and the cameras and all the the stuff people have available to them, we
Mhm.
can do a little better job of monitoring and knowing. And people will send us pictures, and we can say, hey, that's not a cub, that's a yearling, right? That's a 2-year-old bear. It's not, it makes it a little bit easier, but we still triage those same things. And I had people when I was in the park that picked cubs up off the side of the road and brought them to the fire department in Gatlinburg, and they were probably orphaned or hit by a car because they were either so emaciated they couldn't move, or they were knocked out from getting hit by a car. So the ones I've had people pick up, usually it's like, well, it was either hit by a car and mom's gone, or it's been so sick and it's on its last legs and they pick it up. So, but there are people who I think we don't even hear about that might be out there trying to catch cubs or something, and you never even know what happens. And I can tell you in Kentucky, there's a weird streak of people in Kentucky just snatching cubs up from their moms knowingly, and they've had a couple cases. I'm not at liberty to talk more about them, but I just know they've had some cubs and trailers in Kentucky that have been rescued, but the people weren't willing to turn them over.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say, Greg, about I can't remember which neonate now. I know it was from out of state, but sometimes too the stories we get are maybe not the real story necessarily of, but how long that cub has been in somebody's house potentially, and so didn't get the opportunity to wait it out. So it really depends too on the caller, what what they believe is right, and then what they end up telling us. And kind of one more thing I wanted to point out too about the size thing, where they can send us pictures and things like that. When we take in calls, and we built our database to take in these like what we call lead bears, we actually have a drop down that compares to dog sizes, because it's really hard for, I mean, it's hard for biologists and people who work with bears sometimes, depending on the picture, to tell
Hmm.
what the actual height is, what the weight looks like. So we compare them to dogs for the general public in terms of like size. So like one of our size ranges is chihuahuas, terriers, and then the next size up is like shepherds and border collies, and that kind of helps us group them in a way that the public can kind of relate to maybe. And so that can be hard too to gauge, because what one cub might look like to somebody is actually a yearling that might just be kind of small or just a normal size that people underestimate.
Tori, I got to tell you a quick story. I wish you could see my language of bears presentation because I love the idea of the whole dog thing.
Mm.
And I think that that works most of the time. But it's one of my quote unquote funny slides because I tell a story about how people really struggle with ascertaining the weight of bears. And I had a woman, I was at the bear center, I had a woman call in and she was so concerned about this bear that was coming into her bird feeder. And she was talking about how small it was, how emaciated it was. You can literally see the rib cage on this bear as it was coming in. And so she was really concerned about it. She called me at the bear center and I asked her like how big was the bear? And she said, well, it's no bigger than my German Shepherd. So that like was a huge clue for me. And I asked her, so can you estimate how much it weighs? And she says, it can't be any more than 300 pounds. And I'm like, how many 300-pound German Shepherds do you know?
Yeah.
And so there's this thing that happens in people's minds when they see a bear, they think they're larger than life. And I'm sure you and Greg know this. You throw a bucket of water on most bears, and they go from being like this big to like half the size because so much of their body is fur. And so, yeah, I love the idea of doing the dog comparison, but when it comes to weight, I always use the division by two. Whenever someone tells you how much a bear weighs, you divide by two
Yeah.
and you're going to be pretty close.
Yeah, I believe that.
I weed out a lot of cub calls with, if it were a dog, what kind of dog would you say it's similar to? And it's like Lab or German Shepherd. I'm like, yep, that's not a cub, and just like that's the first thing I do,
Yeah.
And but nice, having cell phones and picture messages, 90% of the time, just like, hey, send us a picture, and
Yeah.
then you solve it right there, right? So you didn't have that luxury back then. You guys had email, right? Or did that just back then?
We were just breaking into the email. This is late 90s. So it was
Yeah.
funny because I was hoping
AOL Instant Messenger.
I was hoping there were some young folks on the phone because I could ask him what that was with the
Oh
picture of the
yeah,
phone.
I used one of those once. It was I think my aunt gave us one of those as a toy to play with. It wasn't hooked up, but yeah, it was
Yeah.
fun to play with.
So anyway, the last thing, and then we'll move on to the next chapter. But there's actually a couple of chapters. I know the one chapter, I don't know what chapter number it is, but it's called Catching Cubs. But it's a similar situation where someone was frantic about these cubs being orphaned, and Doug Scott helped work through that situation. And I won't spoil the ending. We'll wait until we get to that one. But I did have another instance of a story that did not even make it into the book. But Kim Delozier, he called me that they were getting reports of this orphan bear over by Metcalf Falls. I think it's Metcalf Falls or on Little River Road.
Metcalf Bottoms, but
No,
there's
not Met.
Mig,
There's a fall.
Meigs Falls. Meigs
Meigs
Falls.
Falls. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Um.
past Metcalf. Yeah, past the sinks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It was by the falls because the falls are kind of set back. And
yeah, off the
apparently
way off the road.
there's a lone young bear cub of some sort that was hanging around by the falls. And as you can imagine, whenever there's a bear that people see, the crowds accumulate. And so I asked him if he's going to bring me the bear. He's like, no, I'm going to see if I can solve the situation. So he went there. He ended up capturing the cub, and then he kind of drove away with the bear, and the crowds dispersed, and he just turned around and went right back there and let the cub go. And the mom was almost instantly reunited with the cub. But it was the one thing I wanted to dispel. You hear about the motherly instinct of bears, especially, well, grizzlies are a different story, but with black bears, you hear you never want to get in between a mother and cubs, and you don't. They can be extremely protective. But there is also the flip side. Black bears have a very strong motherly instinct, but they have usually a much stronger self-preservation instinct, where if the threat is too large, they will abandon their cub. They're not going to go in and fight to the death for their cub. And so that is one of the things that results in some of these orphan cubs when people gather around and do not allow the mother bear, she can be so afraid to enter that scene again because of all the people that she ends up abandoning the bear. So there was a couple of situations we solved simply by dispersing all the people so that mom and cub could be reunited again. All right, got through my ninja and my life lesson. So we're going to move to chapter 10, The Entrappable Bear. And I know Greg and Tori will know the story. This, believe it or not, is not going to be about Milo. I imagine many people, if you've followed the Bear Center for a long time, have probably heard the story of Milo Bear that was pretty much untrappable. That was a cub that I think Coy Blair was trying to capture,
Yeah.
and
He
they
was
were
he was a yearling in that spring of 2016. He came in the winter when I worked at ABR in
okay.
between my internship, and I was living there and
So you were trying
working
to
at.
trap this bear too, then?
Well, I was back working in the park in April when they were trying to catch it, and we released probably like 14 others in April, and I don't think Milo got caught until June because he figured it out. Maybe it was late May, but the rest were all going in April, and it was like, oh, that one's still. And Coy just kept calling. He's like, hey, I haven't got him yet, and Ryan and I would just be like, call when you get him, and then I think they ended up having to snare him or dart him in a
It
hemlock tree or
it,
something.
it was funny
Uh,
because I was paying attention to that whole episode, and it was funny because like Milo's still here, and like they just could not trap that bear, and it was so funny because I had a very similar experience. And so the chapter in my book, The Untrappable Bear, was not about Milo. It was about Milo's grandfather or something, because I had the exact same situation where we were releasing a whole bunch of cubs and catching the other bears was pretty simple. But there was one bear, and it kills me that I can't remember its name. And I went through the files trying to figure it out. But he was driving me nuts because I could not catch this bear. And for those that don't know, the ABR's enclosures, they're pretty large, half acre in size. So there's trees, there's everything that those bears can wander around. And when it's time to release them, you have to get them in a trap. Now, I don't know if this trap is still down in the enclosure. Do you still have that trap?
this that old hog trap, we have it. We don't use it
You
We don't
don't,
anymore,
use
yeah.
it.
but
Yeah.
We
we do
didn't
have
use this too much. Um,
yeah.
typically when we'd trap a bear, we'd have these little have a heart traps. And that's just so you know, that's Jay Clark again, because he used to help me a ton when I was at the Bear Center. But a
That's
little
him
hammer
again.
trap it's similar to
Gotcha.
a hog trap in that it's a some type of cubicle wire mesh frame. And the idea behind it is you bait the trap, you get a bear to go in, and there's some type of trigger or foot pad that the bear will step on and release the door. This hog trap was a little we didn't want to injure any of the bears because that door is pretty heavy, so we used these smaller traps on the right hand side. And so this is typically how we would go in and we would start baiting these traps. And like you would set the trap. A couple hours later you'd hear a cub crying. We go down there and there's one of the cubs that got himself caught in one of the traps. And when I say caught in one of the traps, it doesn't grab him or anything. He just gets stuck inside this cage. And so that is what we would do for every single bear that was going to be released. And much like Greg was talking about, we had a whole crew of bears that we were rehabbing. And they were all coming into that period of time when they were ready to be released. And so we'd go in there, trap a couple of bears, release them, and go back in a couple of days later, trap more bears, release them. And we did that, but there's one bear that I could not catch, no matter how hard he just wouldn't go in the trap. And I remember Kim asking me, he would call me up whether or not I had bear number or whatever it was. And I told him, I said, this bear just does not go in the trap. And before too long, he was the only bear left in that enclosure. And so I'm like, okay, he's the only one left. There's going to be no more food applied anywhere. Like we're not throwing the food over the fence at all. We want the food to dry up. So the only place he could get food is inside that trap. And so then a week or so went by, still cannot get him trapped. Typically we would I think Jay has a can of sardines. They obviously love sardines, but I even went to doing the stuff that bears shouldn't have just to try to get this bear trapped. So went down and got some donuts and pastries from the Townsend Shopping Center, tried that, and every time I go down to see if he'd be trapped, I'd see the bait was mostly gone. And I'm thinking, man, what the squirrels are getting in, some other critters are getting in and stealing the bait. And so I'm thinking, okay, let's do something a little more rigorous. So I would go and get a couple packets of bacon, fry it up so it's kind of rubber, and you can literally tie the bacon in there so it doesn't get moved easy. They're gonna have to work at it. And so I would do that, and I'd wait a few hours, go down, and the bait would be gone. And it drove me like this bear became my nemesis. And so I would go down and rebait the traps. And sure enough, like he'd be up in the tree watching me. He's like studying me, my every move. And so I'd go down again, rebait the traps, and he's watching me. And he kind of knew what I was doing. And like he would even give me the stink eye and be like, I'm gonna get you. And so after days and days of not being able to trap this cub, finally went down there. I loaded the whole thing up. I said, you know what? I am not leaving. We didn't have remote cameras or anything at the time. We just had little holes cut in the side of the blind material. And so I'm like, I'm gonna sit down there. I don't care if it takes hours and hours. I'm gonna see what is going on here. And that little bugger, I swear, you bears will never surprise me again because I watched that thing after I left the enclosure with a baited trap behind me. I watched him. He was up in a tree. He finally works his way down a tree, kind of hunkered down in the bushes for a couple of minutes. Then I see him slowly walking towards the trap. I'm like, oh, this is it. I can't believe how easy it was. And so he goes to the trap, and you can see him sniffing around, and he knew that there was goodies at the back of the trap. And so he starts walking in, and it's like, oh my gosh, he's going to get trapped. And as he's approaching the footpad, because you have to step on the footpad to release the door, as he approaches that footpad, he knew that footpad was, you don't touch that footpad. And I watched in disbelief, and I'm not making this up, folks. He put one paw on the side of the cage up high with his right paw. His other left paw went on the other side of the cage, and he more or less was hovering over the footpad as he's eating on that bait pile. And I wish I had a camera. I didn't have a, but I was like staring in disbelief, and I'm watching him consume this bait pile as he's hovering over the footpad. And I don't know, heavens opened up and looked down on me because at that moment he lost his grip on one of the with one of his paws, and his paw came down and hit the footpad. And as soon as he did that, he knew he did wrong, and he tried backing out, but thankfully the door hit his back end, and he was trapped. And so we finally, or at least I felt vindicated. We finally got him trapped. And lo and behold, we took him and he was released. I think that was like 1998, I believe. And sure enough, was it 16 years later? Um, Milo comes along. So there is a very good chance that Milo is the descendant of this bear, whoever
Yeah.
that bear was. So
Yeah.
anyway, Greg, I'm going to ask you, have you ever had, you could probably talk about trap shy bears.
Yeah. And now at ABR, since Milo and the complications with having large groups of bears, we spend like a week or two prior to the release baiting them into the acclimation pens by only feeding in the acclimation pens. And then we have a remote drop system where we don't have to be there to drop the door. We use magnets on the guillotine doors,
Yep.
and so we can watch the cameras. It's kind of cheating, I know, compared to what you had to do. And I remember Coy sitting down with a rope and like sitting behind the blind and just like holding the rope and like watching and waiting for the bear all night to catch one. But now we get them going into those acclimation pens, and the only time we drop the door is when all of them are in there, and it's the day before, and then it's like, okay, hey, we got them and all are in there together. Because yeah, you leave one out, it can take another day or two before it's willing to go in there. But with the remote system, that makes it easier. And I do agree that the have-a-hearts, they get really trap shy real quick with a have-a-heart. The acclimation pens, they're big enough. They feel safe in there. They feel like they got enough room to,
Yep.
escape. But I had a trap shy bear in the park that, got really good at he would eat all the bait in the culvert trap, right, and not pull the trigger, and you'd know that. But man, he would be 10 yards away from people, and you think you can dart that bear real easily. The moment a green and gray ranger shows up, he's 25 yards, 30 yards away. He knew the game. We tried to use a different trap with a different setup, a Cambrian trap, and he still knew that the moment he pulled on that bait bag, he knew that was no good. And so I actually was able to catch him. Uh, what did we do with that one? Did I end up darting? I had to like sneak around in the dark, just dusky dark in Chimney's picnic area, and hide behind a tree and wait for him to go to a decoy bag of trash. I put a plastic bag on the ground, and he just got distracted enough to forget anybody was there. And but yeah, this I want to say like yeah, bears figure it out, and but man, some of them are just smarter than others. Plain
Yeah.
and simple. Some of them they see something, they recognize it. They're just quick. It's just like a dog that's a little bit smarter than other dogs. There's some bears out there that they know there's something wrong. Something wiggles, something rattles. It makes a little bit of noise, and they know, no, I'm not doing it.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I know w when you mentioned about someone showing up in a green truck, and again, I don't want to spoil any future chapters, but when we were trying to do some aversive conditioning, trying to teach these bears to be afraid of people, you could walk in with whatever implement, whether or not it was a water hose or a can of bear spray, and they would be right up a tree. But as soon as you don't have that implement with you and you're unarmed, so to speak, right back
Yeah.
down. So, yeah, there are some bears that figure it out, and they outsmart us sometimes.
Yeah, well, we talked about that at the Human Bear Conflict Workshop we were at in Montana last week in Kalispell, and there's a woman from Colorado, Heather Johnson is her name, and she had done a decade of studying bears in Durango. You may have heard about some of the Durango bear
Yep.
stuff being out there, right? And she was talking about how many different hazing and aversive conditioning studies they did, and she's like, it takes a while, but people finally just realize it doesn't really work. You can chase a bear out of a place, but you can't really change a bear's behavior because they just adapt to that whatever that stimulus is, whatever that person associated with it is, and maybe in a very specific situation, you can aversively condition a bear to a very specific location, but you can't aversively condition a population. It doesn't
No.
matter what tool you use, you just can't do it. And she's like, "Are we all okay with admitting that it just doesn't work and we got to bear proof things? We have to do bear resistant trash cans everywhere. Like we can't just count on paintballs and bean bags and all these things. And I'm glad someone's finally saying that just because it's fun to chase bears away with paintballs and bean bags doesn't mean it's working.
Right.
Or else we wouldn't have to do it all the time.
Yeah, and Bill Stiver and I think Kim Delozier we did a poster session that is supposed to be presented at the Western Black Bear Workshop about that aversive conditioning, and this was back in 1998, and how it was very specific, scene specific. So you could teach a bear to really run from a can of pepper spray, or like I said, a water hose or something. But as soon as those implements were not in our hands, those bears like knew they weren't going to get zapped or sprayed or anything like that. So it was pretty interesting stuff studying these bears at the Bear Center. So chapter 10, just so you know, the little life lesson there, and I think these are pretty important because they're pretty much plays on lots of very similar life lessons. You always heard the thing, never judge a book by its cover, but never underestimate someone, not even a bear. All too often we tend to look down on someone and downplay their intellect or their skills. Often those are the people that are going to surprise you and you'll be the one looking the fool. And so I know for a fact some bears made me look pretty darn stupid. When I'm getting called by Kim or TWRA asking about when you're going to have that bear trapped, and here it is, you have the bear in a bigger cage, but you just can't get your hands on him. They can make you pretty humble pretty quick. So anyway, this is going to lead us to chapter 11. And guess what, folks? This is kind of going to be a reiteration of what I talked about the last time when I just talked about this story, the call of the den, and it was about a bear getting ready for hibernation. Chapter 11, and I'm going to go off script here where I'm not going to actually follow what's written in the book, but chapter 11 is called Super Sleepers. It talks about how amazing black bears are when they sleep through the winter. But I ended up doing is I ended up stealing some slides from another bear presentation I had that will really try to teach folks about what's going on with black bear hibernation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to put on the biology nerd cap and teach you a little bit about this. And so what the dilemma is for bears and other hibernating animals is they have to figure out how to stay alive without food, without water for possibly weeks, months on end. Now, I totally understand there are some bears that will only sleep for a couple of days, get up, but a lot of bears, yes, even in the Smokies, a lot of bears will go in a den and be there for weeks or even months at a time. And so they have to figure out how to stay alive. If you're not going to eat or drink for a couple of months straight, sorry folks, but you're not going to survive. So that's the dilemma is how do you survive for those long periods of time without food and water? Now, when most people talk about hibernation, especially during the wintertime, they think of something like this. And everyone knows that animals in the Great White North, the Rockies, Alaska, wherever, where you get snows like this, lots of animals hibernate to survive that long period where there's pretty much nothing out there to eat or drink. All the water's in a frozen state right now. And so immediately some folks will think, oh, well, this doesn't happen in Tennessee. This doesn't happen in the South because we don't get snows like that. Well, guess what, folks? The Smokies often looks like this during the wintertime. And although there's no snow on the ground there, guess what else is not on the ground there? There's hardly any food. Y'all know that bears are omnivores and they will eat a variety of meat and vegetable material. The vast majority of their diet is going to be plant material. And guess what you see in that picture? You don't see anything that the bear is going to be eating. Because whenever a bear does eat the vegetation, they're eating new growth. They're eating that lush, green, salad-like material that's fresh off the vine. And that's what they use to nourish themselves. When you have dead plant material like these leaves here, you don't see any green growth growing in this picture. And yes, folks, this is what the Southeast looks like for a number of months. And so an animal as large as a bear is not going to find the food resources it needs to maintain itself if it remained active all winter long. And so I'm going to reiterate about this concept of hibernation because there's so much misinformation out there. And I mentioned this last time, but if you look at the three literal definitions of hibernation, you could ask the average 8-year-old boy or girl in school and say, what does it mean when an animal hibernates? Many of them are going to say means they're going to be sleeping through the winter. That's the kid definition. Well, if you pull out the Merriam-Webster's dictionary and you look up the term hibernation, many of those dictionaries mention hibernation is to pass winter in a torpid or a resting state. Now that's a more concise definition than the kid definition. But then if you want to get into the science realm, the what the biologists consider hibernation, it goes a little bit more technical than that. And so when you look at the science end of things, it's this state of minimal activity and metabolic reduction in animals that helps them survive long periods of time when there's not a lot of resources out there. And so, three different definitions. It goes from not complicated to complicated, but believe it or not, they're all about saying the same thing. And so it's what an animal goes into to pretty much sleep through the winter and conserve their energy. And so, how do they do that? And so, I think one of the coolest things I learned how to do is take something complex and put it into an analogy that a lot of people can understand. So, we're going to start talking about cars. And the first thing we're going to do, we're going to take a car and we're going to fill it up with gas. We're going to give it as much gas, as much quote unquote energy as we can put in that car. And then the goal here is to make that car keep running as long as possible on that one tank of gas. And so, simple question for everyone is which conserves more gas? Like, how will the car stay running the longest? If you drive that car 90 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, or you just keep it idling? Obviously, you just keep that car idling. That's going to keep that car going for the longest period of time. So that's step number one for animals is you've got to slow down. You can't be out and about running around climbing over mountains. You got to be inactive. And so going in this dormant state really helps conserve that tank of gas. And just so you know, when I'm referring to that tank of gas, it's that food, the fat storage that an animal has. And so even if an animal just stays idling where they're not moving around at all, there's something called metabolism, which is pretty much it's what your body does in order to perform the basic needs to keep you alive. So your metabolism is what keeps your heartbeat or your heart pumping, the brain activity allows you to keep breathing. Just the standard things to keep you alive if you're just sitting still. That's your metabolism. The problem is metabolism can also burn quite a bit of energy if you're just sitting there. And you probably know folks that they have a high metabolism where like they can eat all they want, they don't have to exercise, and they don't gain weight because they're burning a lot of energy even though they're not doing much. And so an animal that just sits still throughout the winter, their metabolism is really going to burn through their fat reserves pretty darn quickly. And so the body has to develop a mechanism to really slow down their metabolism where they're not burning as much energy. And that's where hibernation comes in. And there's a couple of different hibernation strategies that animals can employ. And so the first one, and this is one that really causes a lot of confusion. One of the strategies that's employed is called true hibernation. And notice the hyphenation. That is the term. It's true hibernation is like one word there. It's hyphenated. And it's the strategy that a lot of animals like groundhogs use, chipmunks, some of these smaller animals. And what they do when they hibernate is their heart rate is going to go down to just a few beats per minute. Their respiration is going to drop to you can barely hear them breathing or even notice them breathing. And then this is the key thing, their body temperature decreases tremendously. It goes from maybe close to 100 degrees or upper 90s all the way down to about 35 degrees, so just above freezing. And what that does when their body takes advantage of these strategies, their metabolism drops about 50% for every 20 degrees in temperature that their body temperature drops. So going from like 90 down to 35 results in about an 87% drop in their metabolism. So they're burning a fraction of the energy they would be if they were just sitting there in a resting state. And so this allows them to go long, long periods without burning much energy or much of their fat reserves and allows them to last a long time without eating or drinking. Now, an animal in this position, I would say you could pick up a woodchuck that's in deep hibernation and you could slide it across the floor and he's not going to wake up. It's going to take their body hours and hours to bring that temperature up in order for them to become active again. And so that's that term true hibernation. Now, there's other strategies that other animals use, bears being one of them, bears being the biggest animal that uses this. Bears use this hibernation strategy called torpor. And we call it, many biologists call it, they're super hibernators because what their body does is absolutely phenomenal. And so, much like the true hibernators, their heart rate drops to a few beats per minute. Their respiration drops tremendously. Sometimes it's hard to tell if they're even breathing. But this is what separates them. Their body temperature drops, but not the crazy 60-degree drop. Their body temperature usually only drops about 10 degrees. So they're in the low 90s, maybe the upper 80s. So they experience a temperature drop, but it's not as drastic. And so they're more or less sleeping and in this torpid state. That's the root word when you saw the Merriam's Webster definition of a torpid state. And so they're very lethargic. And even though they're really, really warm, they're still 88 degrees, 90 degrees, their metabolism has dropped almost 75%. So they're burning such a minuscule amount of energy, very much like the true hibernators, but they're still pretty warm. And we don't know how they can do that because they're in this warm sleeping state. Now it will take them, they can wake up fairly quickly because it's not going to take long for their body to go from 90 degrees to 97 and to be active again. So this is why bears can wake up pretty easily when they're hibernating because their body temperature doesn't see that drastic of a drop. Now, why is this so amazing? Now, keep in mind, bears that are coming out of the den in the spring, they may have lost 30% of their body weight. So a 200-pound bear going in could be coming out of that den weighing 140 pounds, 150 pounds. That's a pretty significant weight loss. The crazy thing about that is it's almost all fat, hardly any muscle loss at all. Think about that. Use me as an example. I could get on the scale right now and be really disappointed. And I would absolutely love it if I could go to bed for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and wake up and all the fat would be gone. Problem is, if I tried that and I did not move from my bed for 6 or 8 weeks, all my muscle would be gone. I'd just be a blob. I wouldn't be able to move. That's one of the huge differences is when we atrophy, we burn muscle first. Bears burn their fat reserves first. So that's super, super duper cool. The other thing is they pretty much don't urinate or defecate, or very, very minimal for months on end. Their body forms this fecal plug. They don't do it like intentionally, but the inner linings of their intestine kind of sloughs off and it kind of forms this plug. And that helps keep the waste material in because what their body can do is that waste material that they normally defecate, they can recycle it and it keeps going. Humans can't do it. Most other animals cannot do that. We'll soon literally be producing toxins within our body, but a bear can reprocess that. And so that's pretty crazy. The other really cool thing is if you're a female, can you imagine like getting pregnant and then going to sleep and waking up? How nice would that be if like the baby was just there? You didn't have to worry about labor or anything. It pretty much would happen while you're sleeping. Now, keep in mind, oh man, I could do a whole nother lecture on delayed implantation. Maybe I'll save that for another one, but that's a really cool process that bears also do. So the bottom line, when it comes to bear hibernation, which bears in the South, they still hibernate, they just do it a little bit differently than some of these other animals. It remains one of the greatest medical mysteries. We still have no idea how their kidneys are able to process those toxins and reprocess those toxins, how they're able to burn the fat instead of the muscle. And so bears truly are super hibernators. So a little bit different than what the chapter read, but I hopefully put it in a way that you could better understand. Obviously, that's one of my biggest pet peeves is whenever you get on social media, people will talk, oh, bears in the South or in the Smokies don't hibernate. And that's not true. They do. They just do it in an absolutely amazing way, like all the other bears do. So, anything to add, Greg?
That's a I like how you explain that, Daryl. That's really, really nicely laid out. There's a question. If a bear in torpor burns fat all winter, then why is it that their bodies can stay so warm?
Well, the fat being burned is what provides that energy to keep them warm. So it's kind of like it's kind of like you have a campfire, and many of you can attest to this. If you have a campfire, there's some hardwoods that are gonna burn long and slow, and then there's some like if you have pine, you'll burn through that real quickly. The bear's body is designed where that fat is burning kind of like the hardwood, where it's keeping their body temperature up there. Uh, I could probably say I don't think we even know how they can do that because when it comes to humans, if you lie in your bed for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you're not going to be in good shape because you're burning all your muscle first. And so the fact that the bears are burning their fat, that's one of the medical mysteries on how they can do that. And I wish we could figure that out because I would take that pill in a heartbeat. Um, but yeah, I wish I can tell you the actual chemical processes, but the fat serves as that energy burning material.
Yeah, and she said she lives in the southern Rockies of New Mexico, where they have signs warning people about bears being active all year because it's so warm in the winters. So I know you're Daryl, you're kind of down closer to New Mexico than I am,
Well,
and
I was in New Mexico. Who I'm trying to see, Michelle.
Michelle Martindale.
If you want to turn your speaker on, you're more than welcome to.
Uh,
I was wondering, whereabouts were you in New Mexico?
I'm in Cedar Crest, just south of Santa Fe.
Okay, I was in Rio Rancho for 5 years, and so
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I
that's
worked on the
north and
Santa
east to me.
yeah, I worked on the Santa Fe National Forest for about 5 years. So,
Oh, yeah.
the bears absolutely. Well, the thing with the Southwest, obviously, a lot of people think the Southwest is like a desert everywhere, but some of the
Oh,
best skiing and best ice fishing I've ever done was in the mountains. In the Southwest, we have these mountain islands, and so the Jemez Mountains, the Southern Rockies, and then you have these huge mountains. And believe it or not, most of the bears that are in the Southwest are in those mountainous areas. You don't find them in the lowland is where some of those deserts are. So you find a lot of the bears in the mountains. And throughout the wintertime, some of those mountains get lots of snow, but it stays pretty cold. It's very much like most of the rest of North America. You don't have this year-round growing season where you have lots of lush plants like in the middle of winter. it gets pretty darn cold in those mountains. And so very, very similar to what I showed, there's not a lot of food out there. So the bears definitely will slow down, will go into the torpor. Sometimes they'll go in for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. If they found a den up towards the peak of a mountain where you're over 8,000, 9,000 feet and you're going to have lots of snow, they'll stay in a lot longer. But it's highly variable because in the west and the southwest, a lot of it's elevational. So depending on how high up that mountain that bear den could determine how long he's going to stay in that den, he or she. So anyway, welcome.
Yeah.
Glad a fellow New Mexican was in here.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, Daryl, when they're burning that fat in their dens, when they're really, hard denned up, they've got plenty of fur, and the den is well insulated from the weather that you only have to generate so much heat in a tight, small space. It's like, if you've ever been in a little shelter with a candle, you'd be surprised how much heat a candle can put off in like a tiny little shelter, and some of my survival classes I've done for search and rescue work, you experience you experiment with some temporary shelters, and you'd be surprised. You string up a piece of plastic and light a little fire inside of a piece of plastic. You make your own greenhouse, and how much heat you can trap. So they only need to burn so much fat to generate enough heat with all that insulating fur and the rest of the den around them to maintain that body temperature of 90-ish degrees.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because there's a lot of people out there when you talk about bears hibernating, they think bears will find a cave to go into a cave.
Yeah.
And I always picture it like the Scooby-Doo cave where they're walking through the cave with a flashlight and it's like super roomy in there. That is not what a bear den is like. Bear dens are usually these carved out little crevices that they could barely get their body into, and
Yeah.
that keeps them warm throughout the winter because they're not heating a lot of extra space with their body.
Yeah, we've used thermal scopes to find the bear dens in trees, and using the thermal scope and looking at a bear den and a tree den now, you'll see this big warm spot on the tree, in the tree trunk, and you'd be like, "Oh, there it is." You knew you were using the antenna, and you knew you were close, and then you pull out the thermal scope, and you're like, because you're in the wintertime, right? Everything else is cold, and that warm spot on a tree doesn't make any sense unless there's something in there. So it's one of the ways we use a new technology to cheat. Along with GPSs, it's made everything a lot easier. That was probably really frustrating for you guys back in the day.
Yeah, well, it was also kind of fun. We
Yeah,
we
yeah.
would send Jay Clark up in the tree to look down. So
Instead of looking down in the holes, yeah.
yeah.
And I was gonna say, the other thing besides the muscle mass preservation, the bone mass preservation is also another impressive medical mystery, right? Like we would lose tons of bone density if we laid down for months on end, even if we were eating, right? Because you got to bear weight on bones to keep that bone density up, but bears obviously maintain their bone mass and that muscle mass in the den. If we could mimic that with a pill or something else, we could cure type 2 diabetes and all kinds of other chronic illnesses.
And not even maintain it, Greg, but also healing. A lot of healing processes during hibernation is also kind of an amazing aspect of it too, that they slow down so much, but they're able to, heal bones or heal other things. I don't know if you have any examples of that or anything, Daryl, but that's something that I think is still
No,
misunderstood or doesn't, they're still studying it.
yeah, and I don't know, like, obviously hibernation is a whole new realm, but the thing that blows me away is just their healing power of wild animals.
Yeah.
We talked about it last week or 2 weeks ago, where they can sustain some pretty heinous injuries, and you just give them time and food, and they can overcome quite a bit. So, yeah, I wish we can discover a lot of these medical mysteries that elude us to this day.
Hey,
Um,
Daryl, I just had a question about talking about like reptiles specifically, they use the word brumation. Is that just hibernation for
it's
reptiles?
It's hibernation for
Okay.
reptiles. In fact, I was researching that a couple of days ago because I think a lot of the misinformation is just these technical terms. Like people wanting to sound smart, and there's, I want people to be smart, but there comes a point where we try to overcomplicate things. And so
Yeah.
I actually have a graphic. I'll send it to you guys that I put together about surviving the winter and different methods that animals use to survive the winter. And like the first thing I have is migration. You have birds that fly south because there's no food up north because the winters, so they fly south where they can find food. Then you have hibernation, and then brumation is pretty much the same thing as hibernation in mammals, but brumation is in reptiles. But there's also like you can have hummingbirds that will go into torpor, daily torpor, to conserve energy. And so they'll sit on a limb and their body's pretty much shut down. And they do that on a daily basis because they're burning so much energy with their just their metabolism is so high, and you know how fast they beat their wings. And so they got to conserve energy as much as possible. So I think animals are one of the most amazing things to study, and we're far from knowing a fraction of what we can learn from animals if we keep studying them.
Yeah.
Shoot, there's another thing I wanted to say about hibernation, and now it eludes me, but I'm sure as soon as we end this presentation, I'll remember. So, anyway, that's all I have. Unless anyone has any other questions or wants to ask anything about either hibernation or even the previous two chapters, by all means, that's what I'm here for, folks. If not, I just want to say thank you. I'm getting pretty good at this, Tori, keeping it about an hour because we're at
You're great.
59 minutes right now.
Yeah, it's great. No, it's been great, Daryl. Thank you so much. Yeah, so in 2 weeks, guys, it'll be October 29th. And we'll do chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15. But that's about 23 pages in total. So
Okay.
looking forward to it.
All right. With
Hey Daryl, if you get bored out there, you can always come visit us.
I,
We
I I'm
got room.
actually I'm seriously thinking that I don't know if I might have to wait until the um shutdown is over because like I'd hate to get out there and then have to come back the next day. But I'm seriously thinking of coming out there because what I'd love to do, I got to talk to the Great Smoky Mountain Institute to try to get my book in the Sugarlands Visitor Center. So
Oh, try to dream. I know some people. I can connect you
yeah,
with
we'll
some
we'll talk
folks.
about that. But yeah, let's do it in person. I'll make a trip out
Yeah,
east.
they have a new Smoky's Life has a new visitor center right next to us now, in
Okay.
Townsend. Just built a new visitor center. So yeah.
Yeah, no,
All
I'd,
right.
I'd
Well,
love to talk to some folks. So anyway,
yeah.
with that, folks, you guys are great. Love chatting with Tori and Greg and anyone else that wants to chat. So join us again in 2 more weeks. And with that, I will bid you a farewell for today.
Thanks, Daryl.
You're
Bye.
very welcome. Bye.